This video was created from the Advocates in Action presentation, Disability History Highlights, Part 4, the Olmstead Decision and Beyond. It includes 10 slides and runs for 11 minutes. Slide 1, Disability History Highlights, Part 4, the Olmstead Decision and Beyond. Created by Advocates in Action, Rhode Island. Slide 2, Quick Review. There are two images on this slide. Image 1 shows a scene from the Section 504 protests that led to its passage with the words, Section 504. Image 2 shows a photo of President George H.W. Bush surrounded by disability rights leaders as he signs the Americans with Disabilities Act. Take a minute and see if you can remember what Section 504 was about. Section 504 of the Rehab Act made it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities whenever federal funding was used. Now take a minute and see if you can remember what the ADA did for disability rights. The ADA made it illegal for states and private businesses to discriminate against people with disabilities. Section 504 and the ADA are two of the most significant laws ever passed to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities in our country. Unfortunately, although the ADA became the law of the land, discrimination still occurred. In this session, we'll look at the most important Supreme Court decision about the civil rights of people with disabilities in U.S. history. Slide 3, Before the Integration Mandate. There are two images on this slide. The first image is a box with the word non-disabled in it. This box is filled with stick figures of people who are standing to represent people without disabilities. The second image is the same box with the word disabled in it. It's filled with stick figures of people who use wheelchairs to represent people with disabilities. These two boxes have the word segregated written above them. Segregation and being segregated is the opposite of integration. As we've talked about in previous classes, segregation means separating people who are different and keeping them apart. Until the ADA was passed, the laws in our country said it was okay to segregate people with disabilities because they didn't have the same rights under the law as those without disabilities. Slide 4, the Integration Mandate. There are two images on this slide. The first image shows a box filled with stick figures of people standing and the words non-disabled to represent people who don't have disabilities. There's also a circle inside this box. This circle is filled with stick figures of people using wheelchairs and the word disabled to represent people with disabilities. Notice that the circle is also filled with purple, which represents the fact that, although people with disabilities appear to be a part of the non-disabled community, they're still treated differently. The second image shows a box filled with both non-disabled and disabled stick figures, along with the words, just people. This box represents people with and without disabilities as equal members of the same community. Before we look at the Olmstead decision, let's talk about one of the most important outcomes of the ADA, the integration mandate. This mandate said that public entities must administer programs in the most integrated setting appropriate to an individual's needs. In other words, people who want to be a part of the community should be supported to do so whenever possible. Although the ADA made community integration the law, people with disabilities were still being held in segregated settings, such as institutions. They also still received services that weren't community-based. As the first box on this slide illustrates, even when those services were supposedly provided in the community, many of them were still different from what people without disabilities received. Slide 5, the Olmstead Decision, June 22, 1999. This slide shows a 16.5-minute video called The Promise of Olmstead. You can watch this video on our class page. Slide 6, Separate is not equal. The image on this slide is a newspaper headline after the Olmstead decision was announced, which says, Court rules in favor of disabled. The slide also has a colored banner across, with streamers and confetti to indicate that this was a cause for celebration. The Olmstead decision was, and continues to be, the most important civil rights decision for people with disabilities in our country's history. This was a huge deal and big reason to celebrate. Olmstead was the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education for People with Disabilities. Take a moment and see if you can remember what the Brown decision said about providing a public school education for children. In the 1954 Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court ruled that teaching children in segregated settings is illegal because separate is never equal. This ruling applied beyond the classroom and made it illegal to segregate people based on their race. The Olmstead decision did the same thing for people with disabilities. Before we go any further, let's take a moment to explain why a Supreme Court ruling is such a big deal. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. As such, they're responsible for upholding the Constitution, which is the rule book for our country. This means the Supreme Court has the final word in deciding whether or not something is constitutional. Supreme Court decisions establish something called a precedent, which means that all other courts must follow their decision. Slide 7. The Olmstead Ripple Effect in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's 2014 Consent Decree. There are 3 images on this slide. Image 1 is the United States Department of Justice seal, which shows an eagle clutching an olive branch while standing on a shield that's colored with red, white, and blue. Image 2 is a photograph of a water dripping into a clear surface and creating a ripple effect. Image 3 is the logo on the Rhode Island state flag, which shows an anchor over the word hope, surrounded by 13 yellow stars to represent the 13 original colonies. A ripple effect is the chain reaction that happens from a single action, event, or decision. This chain reaction causes other things to happen as the waves it creates spread outward. The ripple effect illustrates how one small change can result in profound, far-reaching consequences. This is exactly what happened in Rhode Island with the 2014 Consent Decree that focused on public schools and adult services for people with developmental disabilities. A consent decree is an agreement that resolves a dispute between 2 parties without any admission of guilt or liability. It means the parties can avoid going to court by agreeing to certain terms. On the next slide, we'll take a closer at Rhode Island's 2014 Consent Decree and what it agreed to do. Slide 8. Rhode Island's 2014 Consent Decree. The image on this slide is a gavel and a scroll of paper with the words, Consent Decree. In 2014, the state of Rhode Island entered into a consent decree with the United States after the Department of Justice found that both the public schools and the adult service system for people with developmental disabilities were discriminating against people with developmental disabilities in direct violation of the ADA. The DOJ found that sheltered workshops and segregated employment programs violated the integration mandate of the ADA. This finding was one of the ripple effects from the Olmstead decision. Rather than going to court and fighting the DOJ, the state of Rhode Island entered into a consent decree and agreed to provide services in integrated community settings. Rhode Island may be a small state, but the 2014 Consent Decree was a landmark civil rights agreement for people with disabilities. The Rhode Island precedent meant that other states would have to stop their segregated service system too, or face a similar DOJ investigation. Slide 9. The Olmstead Ripple Effect across the country. There are 3 images on this slide. Image 1 is a photograph of a man who uses a wheelchair sitting at home while working on a computer and petting his dog. Image 2 is a photograph of water dripping into a clear surface and creating a ripple effect. Image 3 is a photograph of 3 children playing at a public park. Notice that the child in the middle has Down syndrome. The Olmstead decision also resulted in the 2014 Home and Community-Based Settings Final Rule, HCBS. Prior to 1999, the vast majority of Medicaid long-term care spending went to institutions. After the ruling, funding was focused on providing services in home and community-based settings. In other words, it said services should occur in integrated settings. admission of guilt or liability. It means the parties can avoid going to court by agreeing to certain terms. On the next slide, we'll take a closer at Rhode Island's 2014 consent decree and what it agreed to do. Slide 8, Rhode Island's 2014 consent decree. The image on this slide is a gavel and a scroll of paper with the words, Consent Decree. In 2014, the state of Rhode Island entered into a consent decree with the United States after the Department.
Produced by Advocates in Action Rhode Island, 2026. Remember, nothing about us without us.